Senator Back.
Thanks, Acting Deputy President. I'm pleased to rise to support the bill that's before the chamber, and I would have thought that every single solitary person in this parliament, Acting Deputy President, from the other side and this chamber, would want to see the fairness and the equity that has been proposed in this bill. Indeed, those listening who have just walked in might have thought that there's only one group of people who might be the subject of this legislation should it be passed, and that is members of the trade union movement, which of course is absolutely wrong. It will apply to employers, to employer groups, and of course it highlights the fact, Acting Deputy President, that anybody in this country who receives the benefit of funding, including the funding from the taxpayer by way of tax benefits or tax relief, has a very, very strong obligation, and that of course is to be fully accountable to their members, or in the case of taxpayers, to taxpayers. And that is exactly what this legislation proposed by Minister Cash is before us. It's not about unions only, it's about employers, it's about employer groups, it's about unions, it's about anybody who is a registered organisation who actually collects, processes, manages and expends monies on behalf of their members. And what this bill is saying, Acting Deputy President, is that this parliament has an obligation on those people to ensure that those who are responsible for the expenditure of members' monies do so with propriety, with honesty and with transparency. And for those who would think this is some historic event, it is not. Only Friday of last week did we have the circumstance in New South Wales where two people, the ex-secretary of the National Union of Workers of New South Wales, a Mr Derek Beerlin, and his niece, the ex-finance controller, Ms Danielle O'Brien, have been brought before the court on the recommendation of the recent Royal Commission for the illegal expenditure of funds of their members. Now, she's not an inconsequential sum of money, Acting Deputy President. The alleged fraud from Mr Beerlin is of the figure of $440,000, and he was refused bail and is due to appear on a day to be fixed. The young lady was granted bail, but her figure was $430,000. I just want to reflect for a moment, Acting Deputy President, how does it come to be in any organisation, be it an employer organisation, be it a union organisation, be it the RSL, how does it come to pass that a couple of people think that they have the capacity and the wherewithal to knock off nearly $900,000 for whatever purpose? My father was a bank manager, Acting Deputy President. He used to say to me, Chris, if someone's stealing, if a teller is stealing, there are two people to blame. One is the teller who is stealing, and the other is the manager who has failed to put into place strategies so that the teller will understand they will be caught. And if you take that on a macro scale, Acting Deputy President, this is what is before us today. It is of sufficient importance that the Parliament of Australia must address itself to these questions. Not union bashing, not employer bashing. It is looking at the proper activities of those charged with the responsibility and the husbandry of the money of members. So what's happened in this case? How would these two people think that they can knock off, if it's proven, $800,000 from their members? Not taken from employer groups, not taken from the wider public, but taken from the membership fees of their own members. And that's what we are addressing here today. Acting Deputy President, it's interesting to listen to Senator Carr go on about union bashing, etc., etc. As I have said in this place, I am the very proud grandson of Tom Back, who was the secretary of what was referred to as the Lumpers Union on the wharves in Fremantle during the Depression years. The Lumpers Union became eventually, through the Waterside Workers' Federation, became the MUA, a union with whom I have enormous difficulty today. I can assure you all of those comments made by Senator Carr about our side of the parliament I find to be grossly offensive. They are wrong, they are lies, I find them to be offensive. The memory of my grandfather and those like him, acting Deputy President, were the actions of a person who spent every living hour trying to ensure reasonable employment for members of the union, including my father Bill Back and his brother, my uncle Tom Marr, both of whom got work on the wharf when there was work on the wharf in the Depression in Fremantle. So I don't want Senator Carr coming in here and carrying on with the sort of nonsense that I've just heard about this person. I want to reflect, if I can, for a moment, on some of those vagaries about which we have heard. And it does go to the point made a few moments ago, and that is the amendment foreshadowed by Senator Pratt from Western Australia. We know that Ms Cathy Jackson, acting at one stage in her career in a voluntary capacity as the Honorary Secretary of the Health Services Union, would in fact be exempted should this amendment pass. Let's think about that for a moment. Let's think about all those low-paid workers in nursing homes, those people for whom it must be a vocation rather than a job, if the attention that they gave to elderly people like my mother and others who were in nursing homes received. And to think that these people, including a person who at the time was a member of the other place, Mr Craig Thompson, in 2015, the former Health Services Union National Secretary, Mr Thompson, was found guilty of misusing $300,000 for his campaign to enter Parliament, and then other indulgences, apparently including the use of prostitutes and others. As I watched that as the Deputy Chair of the then Education, Employment and Workplace Relations Committee, acting Deputy President, I could never get out of my mind the union fees that would have been being paid by those low-paid workers in nursing homes, in hospitals, in other facilities, so that Craig Thompson could enjoy the services of prostitutes and indeed fund his own campaign for election. And worse than that was the fact that we all know very well that the then Gillard government could not afford for Mr Craig Thompson to leave the Parliament, and should he have been bankrupted, he of course must leave the Parliament, a matter that's being dealt with at this very moment in consideration of another colleague, because, as we know, members and senators cannot sit in the Parliament if they are a bankrupt. And so what happened, and I would invite now Senator Dastyari, who at the time was the Secretary of his union, to come in and correct the record if I'm wrong, Madam Acting Deputy President, and that is that Mr Craig Thompson's legal fees were paid for so that he could continue in the Parliament when there was full knowledge of what this person was doing and was subsequently found guilty of undertaking. I think that was one of the lowest moments in the history of this Parliament, certainly in the 8 years that I've been here, that the government of the day would protect a person against bankruptcy using funds by another union to avoid a circumstance in which he would have to leave the Parliament, and then the government would find itself in a position of not having sufficient numbers to govern. And of course I ask that question, if indeed those funds were paid by then Secretary Dastyari, did the members know that those funds were being used for that purpose, Madam Acting Deputy President? This goes exactly to the reason why Senator Cash has brought this legislation before this parliament, and that is the fact that members of registered organisations, be they employer groups, be they employee groups, be they unions, have got a right to know, first of all, that their funds are being husbanded, that they are being handled honestly, with integrity and with transparency. And so, Madam Acting Deputy President, we go to the legislation to which Senator Carr referred in the final moments of his contribution. And again, they relate to amendments introduced by the then Minister for Industrial Relations, Mr Bill Shorten, in 2012. Remember, this was amendments that the then Labor government brought in. And let me just refer to one of them, if I can, Madam Acting Deputy President, because again, in the brief 5 days that the then Education, Employment and Workplace Relations Committee had to review this legislation introduced by Mr Shorten, one of the elements then, and an element today, relates to the 5 highest paid officials. And with your concurrence, I want to quote from Mr Shorten's second reading speech in the other place, when he was speaking of the levels of disclosure. And this is the comment he made, and I quote, "This bill will require the rules of registered organisations to provide for the disclosure of remuneration, including board fees, of the 5 highest paid officials of the organisation, as well as the 2 highest paid in each branch, to the members of the organisation." Mr Shorten said, "This is not an unreasonable requirement, one have thought." He then went on to say, "Determining the 5 highest paid officials will be based upon monetary remuneration rather than non-cash benefits." But he concluded by saying, "Where an official's remuneration is required to be disclosed, that disclosure will require non-cash benefits paid to the official to be identified." The then Minister, the now Leader of the Opposition, Mr Shorten, was in support of the core key elements of what we are dealing with today. And of course, Madam Acting Deputy President, as you know, there is very strong support within luminaries of the Labor Party for the sort of legislation that is being proposed here today. The former ACTU President, Mr Martin Ferguson, and of course went on to become the Minister for Resources and Energy, and as you know, Madam Acting Deputy President, highly regarded around Australia from everybody in those industries, said, "There is an absolute obligation," said Ferguson, "on the union movement to clean up its house. There is an obligation on unions to put their house in order." The former ACTU Secretary Bill Kelty said this, "I was always on that side of the debate which said that unions are public bodies, so they are accountable to members for their management." The previous Attorney-General in a recent Labor government, Robert McClelland, made this comment, "Unquestionably a case for further legislative reform." And of course we know that the then National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, Paul Howes, was concerned at many of the elements. He spoke about the cancer of dishonesty and how it can corrupt an organisation. At the time he spoke of the need for developing resistance to corruption. Senator Carr and I are on the same page when it comes to that particular issue, Madam Acting Deputy President. And we know, of course, in the democratic system, which is our Westminster system of parliament, that the government of the day, at the time, the coalition government, under Mr Turnbull, had this legislation introduced into this place and rejected twice, which then became a trigger for a double dissolution election. We went to the 2013 election saying that we would clean up the Shorten legislation, that we would introduce the Registered Organisations Bill. We were voted into government in 2013. We then went back in 2016, Madam Acting Deputy President, and we said that should we win government, should we be privileged to continue the government of this country, we would again introduce this Registered Organisations legislation. And here we are back in government. It behooves those in this parliament to respect the voice of the Australian people, and that is what must happen. I am not going to spell out all of those vagaries that I know others have about the misuse of funds by people entrusted to their management by their members, often by low-paid members of those organisations. But what I do want to do is to focus in the couple of moments left available to me as to how this legislation will work. A focused regulator. No variation from the other side of politics on that one, Madam Acting Deputy President. Enhanced financial accountability provisions. Now, the original Shorten legislation, as my colleague Senator Cash will remember, imposed enormous burdens on people to participate in further financial management training, even if they were already highly competent in those spaces. The sensible legislation produced by the government through the minister today simply says enhanced financial accountability provisions with meaningful sanctions that can be applied when wrongdoing is revealed. And we look at those penalties, and these are serious. We're not talking small sums of money. Last Friday, we're talking $800,000 by two people who, because of the culture of that organisation or because of their own dishonesty if proven, seem to think they could walk away with $400,000 each. I just can't believe this. So the penalties, of course, will require registered organisations to disclose the remuneration paid to their top 5 highest paid officers, and I've already referred to the fact that Mr Shorten in government was in agreement with that. Secondly, requiring officers whose duties relate to financial management. You'll get this one, Madam Acting Deputy President. They have actually got to disclose material where they might have a personal interest. Isn't it amazing? If there's a conflict of interest, you've got to put your hand up and say so. We do that here. We do that here. In any circumstance in which there's the possibility of a conflict of interest, we must announce that. So this is now being put into the legislation. Thirdly, we need to ensure in this legislation that officers cannot make decisions on matters where they have a conflict of interest. They must excuse themselves from any decision-making. They must surely be absent from the room. The minutes of a meeting must surely confirm the fact that they took no part in that particular decision-making. And as we know, and as was supported by the then government through its minister, Mr Shorten, civil penalties will range from $18,000 to $216,000 for individuals, over $1 million for a body corporate, employer group or union, any registered organisation, and of course, as there needs to be, Madam Acting Deputy President, criminal penalties for reckless or intentional dishonest breaches of officers' duties up to $360,000 or 5 years imprisonment or both. The wider community has an expectation, Madam Acting Deputy President, that those charged with the responsibility of other people's money will take it seriously, honestly and with integrity, that there will be transparency, and I don't care, further to Senator Carr's comments, whether it's an employer group, a union group, or indeed, I don't care if it's anybody who put their hands up and seeks taxpayers' money, either by way of payment or tax relief, who should also be subject to the same burdens that have been introduced in this legislation.
Thank you.